too cold, human. Then we must share one bed." The quiet alien girl surprised him. He had come to this forgotten outpost in search of some form of redemption, or at least that was what he told himself when the night was coldest and the wind bit fiercest at the bare skin of his arms. Ronan, hair cut close in a practical style that betrayed his past as a soldier, surveyed the desolate field of ice and cracked earth spread out before him. He could feel the frigid air slicing into his lungs. His dark eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. In that moment, he recalled how he had been told this planet was uninhabited, no life signs beyond the faint presence of small, burrowing creatures. Yet that turned out to be incorrect. There was another presence. He had discovered her in a half-frozen corridor of the ancient ruin, silent as a ghost. He remembered the first time he glimpsed her. Her figure was wrapped in sleek, dark garments, shaped to her body. She moved with an otherworldly grace, so quiet that her feet seemed to barely disturb the dust on the frozen stones. Her straight black hair framed a face that looked far too delicate for a place this harsh. Her eyes were dark, seeming to reflect endless depths of midnight. There was a stillness about her, an almost eerie composure, as if nothing around her could stir her from an internal calm. He found it bizarrely compelling. Even from a distance, he thought she looked cold, her pale skin prickled by the frigid air, her arms bare except for the fine, fingerless gloves that ran up to her elbows. A slight tremor in her slender limbs suggested that maybe the environment was getting to her, even if she refused to show it. Ronan wanted to approach carefully, but he needed to figure out who or what she was. Not human, that much seemed obvious from the unusual aura that clung to her. She was there for the same reason he was. The artifact. He did not yet know her name, but he would learn it soon enough. The rumor was that in the center of these ruins, deep beneath the ancient structures shaped by a civilization lost to time, there was something capable of warping magnetic fields or controlling some intangible energy signature. Different sources gave different stories. He was hired to retrieve that object before it fell into the wrong hands. And now here it seemed that the wrong hands might be hers for all he knew. Yet as she looked at him that first time, something in her dark gaze told him that this was not the moment for violence. She too was assessing him, perhaps measuring him as a threat or potential ally. He was no stranger to danger, and as a soldier turned mercenary, he had survived plenty of lethal engagements. He recognized the tension in her stance. Someone who was used to stealth and precise execution of missions. She had that posture of a trained operative, shoulders held evenly, no wasted movement. Her gaze flicked up and down, cool and measured. Only her subtle swallowing revealed she might be feeling the cold. He also felt the cold. He was better equipped, dressed in dark tactical pants and boots, his thick arms partially exposed but usually warmed by the exertion of trudging through the waist-high drifts of snow outside. He wondered briefly if she might be in danger of hypothermia, but her calm gave him pause. She spoke first in a voice that was subdued and softly accented, as though her words were shaped by unfamiliar vowels. "You are not from here," she said quietly. "You must be seeking the artifact as well." He found himself uncertain how best to respond. Should he keep up a bluff, or should he be honest? Something about her level stare made him choose honesty. "I am," he murmured. "And you?" She tilted her head a fraction, as if pondering how much to reveal. She finally answered, "My mission is similar, but the details do not concern you, human." He remembered her use of human in place of his name. Something in him twitched, a faint flicker of annoyance. He hadn't planned on giving her his name either. But a swirl of wind blasted ice crystals between them, cutting off further words. Just behind them, the ground trembled with faint tremors that he had noticed upon arrival. The entire ruin was partly encased in ice, shaped like some kind of massive dome that had cracked over centuries. Light from the pale star overhead spilled in through the broken upper arcs, reflecting on surfaces that almost shimmered like polished stone. The planet's atmosphere was thin and perpetually cold, giving everything a soft hush, as though sound itself froze before it could carry. He had to find a way deeper inside before the creeping numbness in his limbs turned to frostbite. That was when he realized she was following him, or perhaps she knew the way forward. They fell into a tense, unspoken alliance for a short time, walking side by side, steps echoing in a corridor sealed from the wind. The place still felt like a tomb, and he could sense a faint hum under his boots, suggesting advanced technology. She nodded toward a stone door that seemed fused with metal lines in swirling patterns, as though the ancient architects had shaped the planet's minerals into an ornate puzzle. Without speaking, she raised one slender hand and touched the center of the design. A faint glow. That was the only word he had for it, but it was more like warmth, or a faint thread of ember. Spread across the lines, radiating outward. They exchanged cautious glances. Perhaps it was just a power source responding to a living presence. The door slid open soundlessly, revealing a passage leading downward. Ronan felt the temperature spike slightly. Warmer air rose from below, though still frigid. He inhaled, noticing the dryness. The environment was as hostile as ever, but at least the wind didn't cut into his ears anymore. It was there, as they walked deeper, that he learned her name. She offered it so softly he almost missed it. "Naerya," she said, as if that single word was enough to say everything about her. He observed how she did not step away from him, though her posture still kept a bit of distance. She was close enough that he could almost feel the faint heat from her body. He wondered what she was made of, or how similar she was to a human on the inside. Everything about her was so refined, so quiet. He noticed the faint swirl of pattern on her skin near her collarbone, a subtle marking that seemed too organic to be tattoo ink and too subdued to be any kind of glow. It shifted slightly as she breathed, or maybe it was just a trick of the dim light. He found himself strangely fascinated, though he snapped his focus back to their immediate task. The corridor ended at a catwalk bridging a wide chamber beneath. As they peered over the edge, they could see an enormous device in the center, half buried in ice. The ice looked like it had formed in thick layers, turning the device into a giant chunk of shimmering crystals. Naerya's voice rose, soft but certain. "I sense an energy field around it. Don't you feel the hum?" Ronan strained to listen, and yes, there was a sound like faint static or a low musical note that resonated in the bones of his skull. He nodded grimly. "That can't be good," he said. She studied the structure carefully, her large dark eyes narrowing in calculation. "We'll have to disable that. If we don't, we can't remove the artifact. And if we try to approach it directly, the field will likely kill us." She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he caught a hint of curiosity. "You're well built for brute force, human, but do you know anything about deactivating fields?" He scowled a little. "I'm not just muscle. I've done infiltration and demolitions. Don't underestimate me." It was an odd, unspoken synergy, his experience with sabotage and her calm, methodical approach that could dissect problems from every angle. They discovered a control panel on the far side of the chamber, perched precariously on a ledge that had caved in around what looked like old structural beams. She balanced easily on those beams, while Ronan tested them first with his weight, nearly causing a collapse. They managed to cross to the console, though it was jammed with ice. Ronan dug out a small portable thermal device from his belt pouch, setting it to gradually melt the ice. She watched him, expression unreadable. At last she remarked, "It's interesting that you come so prepared, yet you wear your arms bare. Are you not cold?" There was a subtle air of dryness in her tone, almost as if mocking him. He cracked a slight grin. "I've been in colder places, and it's not that I'm not cold, it's more that I don't like feeling restricted." "I can handle it." She paused, gave a small nod. That was the end of that conversation. Once enough ice had melted, she brushed it aside gracefully and tapped the console. They both had to guess at the symbols, for they were written in an alien script, lines that curved in loops and spirals. A portion of them lit up when she touched them. A sudden spark of static jumped, causing her to flinch back. Ronan's reflexes snapped, and he grabbed her forearm to steady her. For a moment their eyes locked. He felt the faint tremor coursing through her muscles, and she exhaled a shaky breath, quickly regaining her composure. She pulled away from his grip, but he didn't miss how her expression had softened momentarily. "I'm fine," she said, voice just above a whisper. He noticed a small burn on her hand, probably from the discharge. Without a word, he rummaged in his kit for a medical salve. She hesitated as he held out the salve, but then allowed him to smooth it gently over the reddened patch. This simple act, so mundane, suddenly felt oddly intimate in the echoing emptiness of the ruin. She studied his face, and he caught a hint of curiosity in her eyes. For all her composure, he sensed that she was not used to humans tending her. He tried to ignore the electricity that seemed to pass between them. Instead, he resumed analyzing the console with her. They agreed on a plan to disable the field. They needed to find its power source. Possibly that source was deeper in the facility, or an offshoot console in an adjoining corridor. They parted ways for a moment, each taking a branching tunnel, planning to meet back here. As he descended a flight of cracked stairs, he couldn't help noticing the trembling of the structure. The further he went, the louder that faint hum got. He found a small rectangular device set into the wall, lines trailing from it like metallic veins. A quick test with his scanning module revealed a significant power signature. Could this be the generator? He began to examine it, only to hear an echoing crash from somewhere above. He cursed and sprinted back up, the cold biting into his lungs, his boots pounding on the uneven steps. He found Naerya pinned under a small avalanche of ice and debris. She was conscious, her breath coming in shallow puffs. Her expression was calmer than he would have expected for someone in that predicament. He rushed forward, bracing his shoulder against the biggest chunk of debris, and heaved it aside with a grunt. She slid free, favoring her left leg, which was partly numb from the impact. She tried to stand, but her balance wavered. His arm went around her waist in an unthinking gesture of support. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, but he sensed her hesitation. Carefully, they moved together until she found her footing. There was a fleeting moment when she pressed closer to him. Her body felt lean, almost brittle, as if she were as fragile as glass. But that was not entirely true. He could feel the wiry strength in her frame, the hint of tension that belied her slender shape. The corridor they were in was half collapsed, so there was no going back that way. The only choice was to go deeper, following what might be a maintenance tunnel. Neither of them liked the idea, but their options were limited. They walked in tense silence, relying on small beams of light from their handheld devices. The walls seemed carved from layered rock, shot through with metallic threads that sometimes shimmered faintly. Ronan turned to check on Naerya every now and then. She never complained, never said she was in pain, but he saw the subtle grit of her teeth. She was determined not to show weakness, so he let her lean on him whenever the path grew uneven. At last, they emerged into a wide, domed chamber that appeared to have once been a control center. Crystalline panels jutted from the floor like stalagmites. The temperature was definitely warmer, but in a damp, clinging way that made his skin prickle. He scanned the room warily. Something about this place felt different from the rest of the ruins. Naerya stiffened at his side, scanning the darkness with those large eyes. "I hear something," she whispered. So did he. A faint scraping sound, as though claws on stone. They crouched behind one of the crystalline pillars, weapons at the ready. Nothing emerged at first, but he had learned to trust instincts honed by countless missions. The scraping persisted, a slow, deliberate sound, as if something was circling. He tried to catch a glimpse, but the light from his device was too weak to illuminate much beyond their immediate vicinity. Then, swift as a serpent, a shape lunged out of the gloom. Ronan barely dodged in time, feeling a rush of air as something large slashed at the pillar, fracturing the crystal. Shards rained down with a tinkling sound. He rolled and came up with his sidearm leveled, firing off a shot in the creature's direction. The muzzle flash revealed a sinuous body perched on twisted limbs, a ridged back, and two reflective eyes that caught the light for an instant. It vanished again into the darkness. Naerya took a steadying breath and aimed a sleek weapon of her own, anticipating the creature's next move. They stood back to back, scanning the chamber for signs of movement. Ronan felt his pulse pounding, adrenaline sharpening his senses. He realized that the hum they had been hearing was much louder now, and it seemed to resonate within the chamber itself. Could the creature be attuned to it somehow? This was no simple animal. It radiated a malevolent intelligence. He felt a subtle shift in the air behind him, dove away just in time as claws raked the spot where he had been standing. Naerya fired, a burst of energy from her weapon. The creature screeched, retreating into the shadows. The two of them shared a look, understanding without words that the best they could do was force a retreat. They didn't have enough data on this thing to kill it outright, and they had a mission to complete. A labyrinth of corridors branched off from the chamber. With the creature stalking them, they had no choice but to pick a path and move. At first, they tried to lose it in the twisting hallways. It followed them regardless, staying just far enough away to remain unseen, occasionally letting out a low hiss that echoed ominously. Each time they tried to find a vantage point, the structure was either collapsed or blocked by the thick layers of ice. At one point, they slipped through a narrow gap in the stone, entering a small chamber that might have once been a storeroom. They found it partially intact, with remnants of alien equipment stored on shelves built into the walls. Breathing heavily, they sank against the wall, listening intently for the sound of the creature. For the moment, it seemed the thing had lost them. Naerya's cheeks were flushed, whether from cold exertion or fear, he couldn't tell. She drew in a slow breath, wincing slightly as she pressed a hand to her injured leg. Even though she tried to hide it, he could tell she was hurting. He swallowed, thinking back to how he always felt a need to protect others. Yet she wasn't a helpless civilian. She was tough, skilled, reserved in ways that fascinated him. Still, she was also a living being, and he felt that familiar urge to ensure she made it out alive. She looked up at him, her dark eyes catching the faint light from a cracked overhead fixture. "We have to find the generator that powers this entire place," she said quietly. "The field, the creature, everything is connected." He nodded. "I found something that might be a generator access, but this place is a maze." She let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "We're not going anywhere if that thing out there hunts us down first." She flexed her fingers as if itching to draw it out and finish it. He understood the sentiment, but they couldn't afford a direct confrontation without more knowledge. "We'll keep moving," he said, "but for now, let's catch our breath. I'll check your injury." She tried to wave him off, but he insisted, gently rolling up the fabric around her cuff. Her skin was pale, an almost translucent cast in the dim light, and bruising was evident where the debris had landed on her. A small gash bled sluggishly. With steady hands, he applied disinfectant and carefully bandaged it. She watched him the entire time, her gaze unreadable. When he finished, he looked up to find her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. In that small, cramped space, he felt something shift between them. Maybe it was just the adrenaline of being hunted, or the enclosed darkness that forced them to rely on each other. Still, there was something else. A faint flicker of warmth, a curiosity on her part that matched his own. They heard a distant scrape and froze, breath hitching, but no attack followed. Slowly they stood. He turned off his small beam of light to avoid attracting attention, letting his eyes adjust to the minimal glow from the overhead fixture. At first it was disorienting, but soon the outline of her features sharpened in the darkness. She was close enough for him to see the faint tremor in her shoulders. She said, quieter than before, "We should move soon." He nodded, realizing how near his face was to hers. He could almost feel the rush of her breath. A moment stretched out between them, poised on the edge of something unspoken. Then, practical necessity took over. He turned his head, scanning for an exit. She exhaled softly, as if releasing tension. Wordlessly, they slipped out through another gap in the wall, determined to stay ahead of the creature. The corridor they found themselves in sloped downward, carved from the same strange stone-metal composite. The hum grew stronger with every step they took. He could actually feel it vibrating in his ribcage. She murmured, "It's likely that the generator is nearby. The energy signature is strongest here." They advanced slowly, weapons ready, until they found themselves in a cavernous chamber. Large columns of layered crystals jutted from the floor, each about as tall as a person, connected by faint lines of light that ran along the ground. The glow was not bright, more like a soft ember flicker. At the center stood a pedestal encased in swirling metal, and on top of that pedestal floated a round object, translucent, swirling with faint shapes inside. It looked like it might be the artifact they both had come for. Ronan felt his heart pound. If it was truly the artifact, then the immediate question was how to get it out of here. The second question was how to deal with the lethal field that presumably guarded it. He stepped closer, ignoring the voice in his head that told him to be careful. She followed, her gaze locked on the object. He reached out a cautious hand, not to touch the artifact, but to sense if there was an active barrier. Indeed, his fingers encountered a tingle, like static electricity. He withdrew, and she pursed her lips in thought. "We need to power down the generator," she said. "Once the field is gone, we can take it safely." He agreed. Looking around, he noticed a series of consoles set into alcoves on the outer perimeter of the chamber. Each console was lit by more of those faint lines threading the walls. They split up, each going to a different console, hoping to find a shutdown sequence. He glanced at her every few moments to ensure she was safe. He could see her slender form half hidden behind a pillar, her hands moving over alien controls. She would pause occasionally, tilting her head, evidently thinking deeply. She was methodical. He admired that. His approach was more direct. Push a sequence of symbols and see what changed. He tried to piece together the logic from the partial patterns he'd seen earlier. A sudden beep from the console made him tense. A wave of energy pulsed through the chamber. He winced, feeling his hair stand on end. Naerya let out a soft cry, her hand flying up to shield her eyes from a sudden flare of bright blue arcs that jumped between the crystals. Then, just as quickly, the arcs died down, settling back into a soft glow. The pedestal in the center flickered, and a swirl of energy rushed upward, dissipating into the dome overhead. Silence fell, heavier than before. Ronan saw Naerya's shoulders relax. It seemed the field might have been partially disabled. They approached the pedestal, cautiously, but no static barrier stopped them now. He exhaled. "We did it?" He reached out carefully, fingers just brushing the surface of the round object. He felt a slight resistance, but not painful. Then he lifted it, finding it weightless despite its size. Trails of faint color shifted inside it, mesmerizing to watch. Naerya stood beside him, transfixed by the artifact as well. "It's not just a power source," she murmured. "It feels like it's alive somehow." They didn't have time to ponder that, because the sound of scraping reached them again, closer this time. The creature had found them. The moment of quiet was over. They spun, raising their weapons, and saw the monstrous form creeping into the chamber, limbs splayed. Its eyes glowed with a predatory light, and Ronan felt the hair on his neck rise. The thing let out a hiss, bearing razor-sharp mandibles or teeth. He couldn't be sure in the limited light. They backed away from the pedestal, artifact in hand. That was when the creature pounced, far faster than they anticipated. Ronan fired, bullets ricocheting off the beast's spined plating. Naerya leapt back, took aim with her energy weapon, and landed a precise shot that seared along the creature's flank. It reeled, letting out a shrill wail. Seizing the opportunity, Ronan rushed forward, hoping to distract it from Naerya. The beast swung a massive forelimb, catching him on the shoulder and sending him sprawling. The artifact rolled from his grip, but didn't break, skittering off to the side. He ground his teeth in pain, pushing himself upright just in time to see Naerya dash around the beast, drawing its attention away from him. She moved with uncanny agility, sliding under a snapping, more to fire a point-blank shot at the underside of its torso. The creature recoiled, hissing in fury. Ronan joined the assault, landing a heavy blow with the butt of his sidearm against one of its limbs. The combined onslaught drove it back. It was wounded, but still dangerous, circling them with vicious cunning. They inched toward the artifact, not wanting to leave it vulnerable. A crucial moment came when the creature lunged for Naerya's head. She ducked, fell, and ended up pinned beneath its weight. Ronan dove in, emptying the rest of his magazine into the side of the creature's skull plating. The beast screeched, thrashing violently, giving Naerya a chance to scramble free. At last, With a final explosive burst from her energy weapon, the creature toppled onto the floor, limbs twitching. Its hiss died away, leaving only ragged breathing in the cold air. They stood there, panting, hearts pounding. Ronan shot a worried glance at Naerya, but she nodded slowly, indicating she was unhurt aside from a fresh bruise or two. He took a step forward, noticing that the creature was definitely expired. A moment of silence passed, and he found his eyes meeting hers. There was gratitude in her gaze, a flicker of relief. He retrieved the artifact, its swirling interior calmer now, as if the storm within had subsided. With the immediate threat neutralized, they turned their attention to escaping, the ruin with the artifact in hand. It was no simple task. The corridors were treacherous, partially collapsed in places, riddled with hazards. All the while, the temperature seemed to drop further as the night cycle outside took hold. They had to cut through tunnels of wind-chiseled ice, occasionally hearing faint groans as the structure settled. More than once they found themselves pressed close, sharing body heat, especially after Naerya's leg injury worsened. She stumbled, biting back a cry, and he caught her. He felt the shape of her slender ribs under his palm, realized how close she was to passing out from the cold and exertion. Then they found a small side room, likely quarters for whoever once inhabited this place. The door, half rusted open, revealed a chamber with a single platform that might have served as a bed. It was covered in a thin layer of frost, the old fabric decaying to near dust. Exhausted and half frozen, they had little choice but to rest. The walls shielded them from the howling wind outside, and the corner was relatively warmer. The sight of her shivering made him grimace. She was trying to maintain her stoic facade, but the chattering of her teeth gave her away. He removed the battered cloak he'd tied at his waist. It wasn't much, but it offered some insulation. He laid it on the bed platform and eased her onto it. He could still see the tension in her jaw. "Look," he said quietly, "you're freezing. I can see you shaking." Her reply was almost defiant. "I can endure it." He exhaled, removing some of his own gear. "Maybe, but it doesn't have to be that way." She eyed him warily. "And you?" He didn't respond in words. Instead, he slipped onto the bed platform beside her, the artifact set carefully against the wall, safe in a pack. Their bodies were close, and he could feel her slight tremors. He pressed a palm to her forearm. Her skin felt like ice. Without hesitation, he draped an arm around her and pulled her gently against his chest, hoping his body heat would help her. For a moment she stiffened, as though uncertain how to respond to such direct contact. Then slowly she relaxed, her face tucked against his shoulder, and she let out a soft, almost weary sigh. You are too warm, human," she murmured, but it wasn't a complaint. More like she was astonished by his warmth. He let out a faint laugh. "I thought you said you could endure the cold." She half smiled, though it was barely visible in the dim light. "I can, but perhaps this is better." The intimacy of that moment was unlike anything he had experienced with an alien partner. She smelled of faint mineral scents, and there was a delicate fragility to her shape pressed against him. Yet he also sensed the underlying strength in her. His heart pounded. They were both exhausted and hurting, forced into this small space. But something about it felt right, as though the adversity they had faced together had stripped away the barriers that kept them distant. He was not sure how long they lay there in silence, simply breathing together. Eventually, the trembling of her body eased. She lifted her gaze, those dark eyes reflecting a warm glimmer now instead of cold distrust. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, noticing how the angles of her face were so elegantly carved, the lines of her jaw curving in a graceful sweep. She inhaled, parted her lips as if to speak, then hesitated. Her voice, when it came, was hushed. "Your name? I should know it." He realized they had never properly introduced themselves. He gave a faint grin. "Ronan." She repeated it, rolling the syllables carefully as though tasting them. "Ronan?" He nodded. "And you are Naerya?" She inclined her head. "Yes." Another brief lull. He swallowed, uncertain of what to do with the rush of awareness that flowed through him. They were close, physically closer than they had ever been, and the potential for something more hung in the air like the hush before a storm. He tilted his head, lightly touching his forehead to hers. Her eyes fluttered shut, and he felt her. Breathe in. A subtle sign of her acceptance. Slowly, he leaned in, brushing his lips to hers in a tentative gesture. She let out a soft sound, so quiet he almost missed it and did not pull away. The kiss was a gentle thing, marked by the chill of her lips and the warmth of his. He sensed the swirl of conflicting emotions in her, the precarious balance between caution and curiosity. When they parted, her eyelids lifted, and he saw something new in her expression, an openness he hadn't seen before. But words were not exchanged. Instead, she let her hand rest on his shoulder, returning his embrace with quiet trust. That night, the storm outside raged, the structure groaned, and they huddled together on the narrow bed platform. Though their rest was uneasy, their closeness offered a measure of comfort that neither had expected. At some point, as exhaustion claimed them, he felt the soft weight of her head drifting to his chest, and his eyes closed, lulled by the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing. When daylight came, or the planet's equivalent of it, they rose stiffly, searching for food and water from their supplies. They had to keep moving. The artifact was in their possession, which meant it was only a matter of time before other forces, perhaps less benevolent, came after it. As they made their way through the corridors, they discovered a collapsed portion that revealed a path back to the upper levels. They followed it until they reached the surface, squinting in the searing brightness of the pale star. The landscape was bleak, wind-swept ice and rock, but at least it was open. The crackling hum they had felt below was gone, replaced by the quiet rustle of wind over a barren terrain. Ronan scouted ahead, ensuring no immediate threats. Naerya trailed behind him, her limp noticeably better but not gone. Now that they were out in the open, the temperature felt even more brutal, the wind cutting at them with relentless ferocity. She paused at one point, hugging herself in her thin attire, and he realized they couldn't simply trek across the surface in this condition. His gaze scanned the horizon, spotting a structure to the east, possibly the remains of a docking bay or a small station. It was their best hope for shelter or a means of escape. They trudged for hours, the artifact carefully wrapped in a protective casing. The conversation was minimal, each breath stolen by the cold, but Ronan felt the tension that had existed between them morph into a sense of shared purpose. They had decided, in unspoken unity, that they would figure out what to do with the artifact. Together. He could sense her trust in him growing. That knowledge warmed him in ways the climate could not. Eventually, they reached the structure, a partially collapsed dome with a series of half-buried rooms. Inside, they found a functioning console that still had power, perhaps solar cells or geothermal energy. Ronan tested the communications array. Static greeted him, but he was able to punch in a few frequencies. No immediate response. Naerya crouched beside him, analyzing the console. "It might take time," she said softly. "Let me try to decipher the interface." He moved aside, watching her delicate fingers glide over the alien symbols. Her composure was remarkable. Even though they had nearly died multiple times in the last day, she seemed so focused and calm. He found that admirable and strangely reassuring. She eventually managed to coax the console into generating a partial shield for the room, blocking some of the wind and warming the interior slightly. Another set of controls hinted at some sort of emergency beacon. She activated it, hoping it might call for rescue or at least draw attention from friend rather than foe. In the respite that followed, they took inventory of supplies. They had enough rations for a couple of days, water packs for maybe less. He caught her rubbing the soreness in her leg. Concerned, he settled beside her on a makeshift bench. "Let me see." She shifted uncomfortably, but let him gently roll up her pant leg again. The bruise had darkened, and the cut was a little inflamed. He cleaned it carefully, applying more salve. He felt her eyes on him the entire time. At one point, she reached out, letting her fingers brush the side of his face. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. He wasn't sure how to answer. Eventually, he said, "I guess. I spent years taking orders, fighting for pay, not caring who got hurt as long as I finished the job. but I was always the type to watch out for my squad, make sure no one got left behind. Now if I can keep someone safe, I do it." She regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "I've never understood that instinct," she admitted. "In my world, each stands alone. Failure is not tolerated, and there's little compassion." Her eyes dropped. "Sometimes I resent that about my people, but I never questioned it until now." He set aside the first aid kit, resting a hand on her knee gently. "Maybe you and I can question it together," he said, voice hushed. She gave him a look that was half acceptance, half uncertainty, but she didn't pull away. The moment stretched, and this time she was the one who leaned in, pressing her lips to his. He met her kiss with a tenderness that surprised him, a careful exploration that soon deepened as they let go of the tension that had been building between them. Their breath mingled in the cold air. Her hand found its way around his neck, drawing him closer. He tasted her quiet longing, sensed the fragile barrier she held around her emotions. Gradually, that barrier gave way, replaced by trust and desire. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. He let his own arms slip around her waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her clothes. He heard her soft intake of breath as she pressed closer. A new kind of heat blossomed between them, igniting more than just survival instincts. When they finally separated, her cheeks were flushed, her voice a breathy whisper. It's just, you're so very different from what I'm used to." He ran a hand through her black hair, noticing the silky texture. "Guess we're both treading unfamiliar ground." Neither of them spoke further, but the tension that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged with a promise. They both felt it. This connection wasn't just a fluke of circumstance. There was something real here. Then came an electronic beep from the console. They broke apart instantly, both turning. A faint light pulsed on the screen. Naerya hurried over, tapping the symbols. She looked at Ronan with a hint of excitement. "Someone's responding," she said, "but the signal is weak. I'm not sure if it's friend or foe." Ronan nodded, quickly getting to the console. They listened. Static crackled, then a distorted voice in an unfamiliar language. Naerya tried a few of her own words in an alien dialect. The response came back, sounding urgent but not overtly hostile. She glanced at him. "They might be from my faction. Or a different outpost, we can't be sure." He exhaled. "We need to be prepared. If they come, we show them we have the artifact, but also that we're not handing it over without a fight." She gave him an uncertain nod. Time passed slowly. They found a storage crate that contained something resembling blankets. Old, musty, but better than nothing. They shared those, huddling in a corner while the frigid air outside howled. Occasionally they'd check the console, hearing that static-laced voice attempt communication. Naerya managed to piece together that a shuttle might be inbound. Ronan found his chest tightening at the thought. They had come all this way to secure the artifact, faced the creature, nearly died. Now the question was, who would truly end up with it? She seemed to sense his unease. "Ronan," she began, settling beside him on the floor, "I need to ask something. If this is my people's vessel, I am obligated to deliver the artifact to them. It was my mission." She hesitated. "But after everything, I'm not sure I can trust them. If it is not my people, it could be a different faction. Perhaps even more dangerous. I don't want the artifact to fall into the wrong hands." He studied her face, saw the conflict warring in her eyes. "We have to make a decision. Either we hide the artifact, or we risk handing it over," he said. She nodded. "Hiding it might mean no one can use it to harm others, but it might also mean its potential for good is lost. I can't see a clear path." They talked it through in hushed tones while the wind battered the dome. He told her about the horrors he'd seen in conflict across the galaxy, weapons that could annihilate entire worlds if used irresponsibly. She told him about the rigid hierarchy of her people, how they valued perfection and might harness the artifact for questionable aims. By the time they finished, it was clear that they would not simply relinquish the artifact to anyone, no matter who arrived. They would weigh any newcomer carefully. That night the temperature plummeted even lower, and they took refuge in each other's arms once more. This time, the closeness was more than just warmth. In the dim glow of the console, lights, they let the bond they had formed deepen. Whispered words gave voice to unspoken fears and desires. Slowly, their caresses turned more intimate. Her cold fingers traced his shoulders, his back, learning every muscle as if mapping new territory. He responded in kind, letting his hands explore the curve of her spine, the delicate slope of her waist. The kisses they exchanged ignited a spark that spread through their bodies. She straddled his lap, pressing her slender form to his. The air felt charged, every brush of skin a reminder of how alive they were, how precariously life teetered in this brutal environment. He let out a quiet groan when her lips found the crook of his neck, her breath ghosting over his pulse. They both shed layers of clothing, mindful of the cold but unable to resist the urgency building between them. When her fingers moved over the scars on his chest, he felt an unexpected wave of vulnerability, as though her touch was healing wounds far deeper than skin. She murmured something in her alien tongue, soft and reverent, before kissing the spot, gently. He eased her onto the makeshift bed, such as it was, a flat crate they'd covered with the musty blankets, and pressed himself against her. Her skin, though still cool, warmed under his touch. Their breathing quickened, and they shed the last barriers between them. He could see the subtle shifting of patterns in the faint lines on her neck, as though her body responded to his closeness, in a way that was uniquely alien. Her eyes fluttered closed when he traced a path down her collarbone to the soft plane of her stomach, and she arched her body with a hushed moan that he immediately memorized. They moved together slowly at first, each caress exploring new textures and sensations. Her whispered gasps echoed in the stillness. When at last they allowed themselves the final intimacy, it was with a heady mix of tenderness and unrestrained desire. He cradled her face as their bodies linked, capturing her parted lips in a heated kiss. Her nails grazed his back, and he welcomed the brief sting. The act felt more than physical. It was a binding of two souls who had only days ago been strangers with opposing missions. Everything about her presence, the subtle scent of mineral-laced air, the quiet moans that escaped her lips, the way her hair brushed over his shoulders, stirred something deep in him, a longing he had not known he was capable of. She clung. To him, her breath ragged, as waves of sensation carried them both. And in that moment, as they crossed the threshold of pleasure and vulnerability, it was as though the cold receded from existence, leaving them in a cocoon of shared warmth. When the tension crested, they both let out soft cries, their bodies tensing and then releasing in a final, shuddering embrace. He felt her bury her face against his neck, trembling not from cold, but from the remnants of ecstasy. He exhaled, pressing his lips to her temple, murmuring her name, Naerya, like a vow. Gradually, they settled into each other's arms, hearts still pounding. She sighed, brushing a stray bead of sweat from his brow. Her voice was hushed and strangely vulnerable. "I never knew it could feel like this," she admitted. He stroked her hair, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Neither did I," he whispered. The weight of their shared experience wrapped around them. They let the stillness stretch, enveloping them in the aftermath of their union. They drifted asleep, lulled by the sound of the wind and each other's steady breathing. When the new day arrived, they woke to find the console blinking urgently. The inbound shuttle was due to arrive soon, the communications repeating the same. Signals. With cautious resolution, they prepared for the encounter, donning their clothes, lacing boots, securing weapons. The artifact rested snugly in a protective pack, and they agreed that, should the newcomers prove hostile, they would defend it and each other at all costs. Stepping outside, they found the wind had calmed slightly, and the sky was a pale, washed-out color. They climbed a ridge overlooking a wide stretch of ice where a craft might land. Sure enough, they saw a speck on the horizon growing larger. Ronan's breath caught, and he looked at Naerya. Her face was set in grim determination, though he sensed the turmoil beneath. He placed a reassuring hand on her back, and she accepted, the gesture without flinching. The shuttle, sleek with angled wings and a faint metallic sheen, touched down with surprising grace, a cloud of ice crystals kicking up around it. A ramp lowered, revealing figures in dark attire, not unlike Naerya's own. She inhaled sharply, stepping forward. Ronan stayed close, scanning each figure. They were armed, but not pointing weapons at them yet. The tallest among them approached, helmeted. In clipped words, he addressed Naerya, using a language Ronan didn't understand. She responded, and an exchange followed. He watched her expression carefully, reading tension in the set of her jaw. After several minutes of back and forth, Naerya turned to Ronan, speaking in the common tongue. "They say they're here to retrieve me and the artifact for my people," she explained. "They promise no harm, but I sense impatience." Ronan kept his hand on the pistol at his hip. "Do you trust them?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then said, "I don't know, but we can't stay here forever." They advanced together. The tall figure removed the helmet, revealing features somewhat similar to Naerya's. Pale skin, dark hair, though the eyes had a sharper tilt. He regarded Ronan with a disdainful glance, then returned his attention to Naerya. Another quick dialogue ensued. Ronan could tell from Naerya's posture that she was standing her ground. At one point she placed a protective hand on the pack containing the artifact. The tall figure seemed displeased, raising a brow, but after more discussion, the figure signaled to the others. Weapons lowered slightly. Naerya turned again to Ronan, voice subdued. "They claim they'll take us both to a safer outpost, that we can decide what to do with the artifact once we're secure. They want me to hand it over now, but I refused. I said I'll keep it until I'm satisfied with their intentions." He arched a brow. "And they agreed?" She nodded, though her tone carried uncertainty. "For now, but we must remain cautious." Ronan exhaled slowly, scanning the rest of the group. They appeared well trained, with an air of discipline. He recognized the aura of a specialized unit. He wondered if they would try to forcibly take the artifact once they were aboard. Nonetheless, they followed the group up the ramp into the shuttle. The interior was stark, metallic surfaces reflecting pale overhead lights. A faint hum of machinery filled the cabin. Ronan stayed close to Naerya, quietly checking every corner. The tall figure introduced himself as Commander Arath. He spoke to Ronan in passable common. "So, you are the human who aided our agent?" Ronan nodded stiffly. "I am?" Arath's gaze flicked over him. "I suppose we owe you thanks, but do not expect that we will simply allow you to keep the artifact." Ronan didn't flinch. "I only want to ensure it's not used for destruction." Arath's lip curled slightly. "That depends on your definition of destruction." Naerya stepped in, her voice sharper now. "Commander, I have reason to believe the artifact cannot be safely used for aggression. It's more than a power source. It can respond unpredictably to violent intent." Arath raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Our scientists will examine it." Tension thickened. The shuttle lifted off, thrusters rumbling. Naerya took the seat beside Ronan, gripping his hand under the console so no one else would notice. He squeezed back, sensing her nerves. She was likely grappling with the fear that her own people might turn on her if she refused to comply with their demands. The journey wasn't long. They landed in a facility that was built into a mountainside of swirling stone and ice. The Giao architecture reminded Ronan of the ruin they had left behind, but less decayed. Arath led them inside, flanked by guards. The corridors were lined with thick, polished walls that rippled with faint reflections of light, reminiscent of the ancient construction but better preserved. The air was crisp, though significantly warmer than outside. They eventually arrived at a secure chamber with seats and a large table. Arath gestured for them to sit. He took a position at the head of the table, while several subordinates stood. Behind him, Naerya placed the artifact on the table, within arm's reach, and folded her hands in her lap. Ronan stood beside her chair, arms crossed. He could sense the guards tensing. "Please," said Arath, gesturing for him to sit as well. Ronan did so reluctantly. "We have a chance to discuss the next steps," Arath continued. "Our civilization is not destructive by nature. We have fought for our survival, yes, but that is the galaxy's nature. Our scientists believe this artifact could revolutionize energy production for our entire system. With it, we can end dependence on lesser technologies that pollute our worlds and hamper our growth." Ronan studied Arath's face, trying to gauge sincerity. Naerya's expression was unreadable, though he could see her shoulders tense. She asked quietly, "How do we know it will not be used for more violent means? My mission was to retrieve it because we believed others would exploit it. How are we any different if we keep it for ourselves?" Arath's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you questioning our directive? You, who accepted the mission?" Naerya drew a breath. "I am questioning the fate of this device. A weapon so powerful cannot be entrusted to any group without oversight." Arath's gaze slipped to Ronan, then back to Naerya. "It seems your time among humans has muddled your loyalties." Ronan bristled, but said nothing. He could sense Naerya's pulse quickening. She responded with a quiet calm. "Perhaps it has shown me a broader perspective." A tense silence followed. Finally, Arath said, "We will examine the artifact. If it can be safely utilized for peaceful ends, you have my word that it will not become a weapon." The promise sounded hollow to Ronan, but he saw Naerya's shoulders relax a fraction. "Let me be part of that examination," she said. "I need to see for myself." Arath took a long moment before nodding. "Very well, but we cannot allow your human companion to accompany you in the lab. The facility is restricted to our personnel." Ronan started to object, but Naerya rested a hand on his arm. He read the look in her eyes. "Trust me." He remained in that chamber, flanked by guards, while Naerya carried the artifact away with Arath. Time crept by. He began pacing, ignoring the annoyed glares of the soldiers. 1,000 anxieties churned in his mind. This was the moment that would decide everything. Would she side with her people and hand over the device unconditionally, or would she fight for what they had talked about? He remembered the closeness they had shared, the way her body felt against his in the darkness, how she had whispered his name in wonder. That wasn't a lie. She had changed, just as he had, and he realized he loved her with a clarity that took him by surprise. He loved her calm logic, her quiet intensity, her willingness to look beyond the boundaries of her mission. An hour passed, perhaps more. At last, the door slid open, and she returned. He rose to meet her gaze. She looked exhausted, hair slightly disheveled, as though something dramatic had transpired. Arath followed, wearing a measured expression. He cleared his throat. "We have conferred. The device responds to emotional states, to the intent of the one wielding it. Our technology can harness it, but only if we maintain harmony among our scientists." Ronan frowned at the vagueness. Arath continued, "Naerya has convinced me of a middle path. We will keep the artifact under observation, but the final say in its use will require a unanimous vote by our council. This is not a perfect guarantee, but it's a safeguard beyond any single individual's control." Ronan exhaled slowly. He saw the question in Naerya's eyes. Is this enough? She had tried to push for more stringent measures, but maybe this was the best compromise possible. He stepped forward. "What if your council decides to use it for war? That's still a possibility," he said. Arath's gaze flicked to him. "Yes, it is. But we do not wage wars lightly. If we fail in this promise, then we are no better than the ones we sought to keep it from." Naerya added quietly, "I demanded that if there is any sign of misuse, I be allowed to remove it. They agreed, if somewhat reluctantly." She cast Arath a pointed glance, and he inclined his head. Grudgingly, Ronan wondered how she would possibly remove it if the entire council turned hostile, but he knew better than to say it out loud. She was taking a leap of faith in her people's sense of honor, and perhaps it was a step forward. He shifted, glancing at her. "And us?" he asked. "What now?" A flicker of warmth passed between them. She looked at Arath, who sighed. "You may stay if you wish, though your presence is irregular here. But Naerya insists that if we are to trust her with the artifact, she wants you by her side." Ronan's chest tightened with relief. "I will stay then," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. Arath said nothing more, simply turning on his heel and marching out. The guards followed, leaving the two of them alone in the chamber. She exhaled, shoulders sagging in fatigue. He stepped to her side, touching her arm gently. "You did well," he said. She looked up at him, dark eyes brimming with an odd mix of weariness and hope. It was not my sole choice, but at least this way we have a chance to influence what happens next. He nodded. We do. Together. She laid her hand over his, leaning in to rest her forehead against his chest. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. Thank you, he murmured. She lifted her gaze, eyebrows knit in question. He explained quietly, for choosing to stand up for what we talked about, for trusting me. Her lips curved in a tired smile. You're the only one who's ever shown me that trust and compassion can be a strength, not a weakness. The days that followed were a blur of formalities, meetings with scientists, repeated demonstrations of how the artifact functioned in controlled environments. The facility staff eyed Ronan warily, but over time, some came to accept that he was there at Naerya's behest. She rarely left his side, except when absolutely required. At night, she would lead him through a winding corridor to a small chamber they had provided for them. It was sparse. A bed, a single table, a lamp set into the wall. But it was warm, and that was enough. In the privacy of that room, they let themselves forget the cold stares and suspicious questions. Some evenings, they lay entwined on the bed, sharing whispered stories of their pasts. He told her about the mercenary campaigns he regretted, the nights he spent haunted by nightmares of faces he could not save. She told him about her training, how she had learned from a young age to suppress emotion and rely on logic, never letting any bond distract her from duty. They discovered they had more in common than they realized, a sense of loneliness, of being misunderstood, or judged for not fitting perfectly into the mold of their societies. The closeness they shared in that bed went beyond physical. Each gentle touch and lingering kiss carried an unspoken promise that they wouldn't face the darkness alone anymore. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when the facility was hushed, they found deeper expressions of intimacy. He would wake to find her pressing soft kisses along his collarbone or whispering his name in a tender hush. He would shift to cradle her slender body against his, letting the warmth of their bare skin intertwine. They moved together in slow, unhurried ways, savoring the closeness. They learned each other's signals and rhythms, a dance of breath and heartbeat that felt simultaneously fragile and unbreakable. Afterwards, they would lie tangled in each other's arms, sharing the hush of the facility before it bustled to life. It was during one of those dawn moments that she turned to him, pressing a palm to his chest. Her eyes were serious. "Ronan," she said softly, "I asked Arath about you staying here. Truly staying, not just as a guest." He lifted his head, surprise evident on his face. "And?" She took a breath. "He said it's unprecedented, but if the Council approves, you could become something like a liaison, a link between our worlds. Because the artifact affects more than just us. It could shape the future for many species. If you want that, we can remain side by side." His heart thumped, and he propped himself up on his elbow, regarding her. "Do you want that?" he asked. Her gaze flickered with emotion. "I do." A small, almost shy smile touched her lips. "If you prefer to return to your people, I will not stop you, but I would miss you." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a tender, lingering kiss. Then he whispered, "I'll stay. With you." Relief washed over her features. "Then we'll face the Council together," she said, voice trembling slightly. He nodded, heart brimming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. When the day came to present their proposal, they stood before a semicircular panel of elders. Each elder had a distinct bearing, wearing formal robes embroidered with swirling motifs that echoed the architecture of the facility. Naerya spoke with measured conviction, explaining that the artifact's influence was too significant to confine to her people alone. It could be a unifying force among multiple races, potentially preventing conflicts if shared responsibly. Ronan added his perspective as a human with experience in war-torn regions, emphasizing that secrecy and singular control often led to power imbalances. Some of the elders appeared skeptical, others intrigued. After a lengthy debate, the council retired. To deliberate, Ronan and Naerya waited in an antechamber, nerves on edge. He took her hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "No matter what they decide, we have each other," he said softly. She nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. It felt surreal to realize how much their lives had changed in such a short span. They were no longer enemies or simple strangers. He felt a love for her that outweighed any fear of the future. Finally, the council reconvened. Their spokesman announced that while the artifact would remain under the guardianship of Naerya's people, they would open discussions with the Human Federation and other potential allies to form a cooperative stewardship. Moreover, Ronan would be allowed to stay as an observer and consultant. The specifics would be ironed out through negotiations, but the principle had been agreed upon. Naerya let out a quiet, relieved breath, meeting Ronan's eyes with a glowing expression. The elders filed out, leaving them alone in the council chamber. She turned to him, a soft laugh escaping her lips. He gathered her into his arms, pressing a joyful kiss to her mouth. She clung to him, letting that kiss deepen, aware that they stood at the threshold of a monumental change for both their worlds. When they finally pulled apart, she murmured against his lips, "Do you think we can do this? Merge our paths for good?" He rested his forehead against hers. "I'm ready to try, every step of the way." They were escorted back to their quarters, and for the rest of that day, they made plans. She would remain involved with the scientific team studying the artifact, ensuring it was used responsibly. He would assist in forging the relationships with outside parties, bridging gaps. It was a daunting prospect, but it also felt like a new beginning. Later that evening, they gazed out a window carved into the side of the mountain. The sky was a swirl of muted colors, a faint aurora shimmering on the horizon like ribbons of ghostly light dancing over the ice. He slipped an arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. He whispered, "Remember when we were freezing in that ruin, stumbling through darkness, chased by that beast?" She gave a soft chuckle. "How could I forget?" He kissed the top of her head. "It's hard to believe we found something so beautiful in that cold, hostile place." She turned, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "We found each other," she said quietly. "That was worth all the ice in the world." He felt a swell of emotion that left him momentarily speechless. At last, he said simply, "Yes, it was." In the days and weeks that followed, they settled into a routine of sorts. Working by day with the scientists and emissaries, forging mutual understanding between species, and retiring by night to the small chamber they shared. The artifact was kept under multiple layers of security, but Naerya had a say in every decision made regarding its study. Arath, though somewhat aloof, seemed to respect her growing leadership role. Ronan adjusted to his new environment, occasionally feeling the pang of being an outsider, yet every time he looked into Naerya's eyes, saw the warmth that now dwelled. There, he knew he belonged. They sometimes teased each other about the day she first called him human, with such icy disdain. Now she used his name as though it were the most precious word on her lips. The final test came in the form of an unexpected threat. A rival faction that had caught wind of the artifact's existence. Reports arrived of unidentified ships gathering near the system's edge, preparing a possible incursion. Tensions rose within the facility. Arath doubled security, deploying patrols. The council members debated whether to power up the artifact for defense. Naerya opposed the idea, fearing the artifact's unpredictable nature if used aggressively. Ronan supported her stance, reminding them that turning it into a weapon was precisely what they had vowed to avoid. One elder argued that they had to protect themselves. Another said it would be a betrayal of the new alliance. The debate raged. The standoff came to a head when a small fleet of hostile craft tested the perimeter, skirmishing with outlying defense platforms. In the command center, alarms blared. Arath looked to Naerya and Ronan for input. She refused to let them harness the artifact for violence, instead proposing they utilize the device's ability to emit a disorienting field that could disable non-friendly weapon systems without lethal force. It was a risky plan. If the artifact reacted negatively to the fear and aggression swirling among them, it might lash out in catastrophic ways. But it was better than turning it into a blunt instrument of destruction. Together, they hurried to the secure chamber where the device was kept. Scientists scrambled to initiate the override protocols that Naerya and Ronan had helped design, allowing the artifact to channel a controlled emission. The key lay in maintaining a calm emotional environment, ensuring that the device interpreted their intent as defensive, not murderous. Ronan could feel his heartbeat hammering as sirens sounded in the hallway. He stepped to Naerya's side, letting her see the steadiness in his gaze. She nodded, placing her slender hands over the artifact's surface. Beneath her palms, the swirling interior seemed to respond, flickering with faint pulses of color. Arath, standing close by, barked orders for the staff to remain calm and follow Naerya's lead. The next minutes felt like a delicate balancing act. Naerya controlled her breathing, focusing on a mental image of peaceful resolution rather than violent confrontation. She guided the scientists on how to calibrate the feedback loops. Ronan stood behind her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent anchor for her concentration. He too kept his mind fixed on the idea of preventing harm. A subtle hum built in the chamber, rising in pitch until it felt like it reverberated in their bones. Lights flickered, and the swirling patterns inside the artifact glowed brighter, cycling through subtle hues of color that danced like liquefied gemstones. The tension in the room was electric, every person acutely aware that one stray thought of malice might set the artifact off in a disastrous way. Then, with a final surge, the device emitted a wave of subtle energy. It rippled outward, passing through walls and machinery, traveling into the vacuum of space where the rival ships hovered. The command center monitors showed the ship's weapon, signatures dropping offline, their targeting systems scrambled. The hostile vessels floundered, unable to fire. Arath instructed the defense platforms to stand down, giving the intruders a chance to retreat without bloodshed. Faced with no way to mount an effective attack, the enemy ships soon turned and jumped away, leaving the system. A wave of relief flooded the facility, cheers erupting among the staff and soldiers. Ronan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Naerya nearly collapsed from the strain of maintaining her calm focus under such pressure. He caught her in his arms, holding her gently. Arath approached, momentarily dropping his stoic demeanor. "Well done," he said to them both. "Truly, you've demonstrated another path." Naerya met his gaze, breathing heavily. "It was not me alone. We all had to stay calm." Arath nodded gravely. "Perhaps we are all learning. This outcome could have been so much worse." Ronan pressed a kiss to Naerya's temple, pride and gratitude mingling in his chest. She smiled wearily, leaning into him. In the following days, negotiations with the rival faction began, initiated from a position of measured strength but also goodwill. The facility became a beacon of cooperation, rather than a fortress of isolation. Ronan and Naerya took on the role of mediators, showing that a human and one of her people could stand side by side, unified in purpose and heart. The artifact remained under careful monitoring, but now the Council seemed more inclined to use it only for protective measures, if at all. At last, when the immediate crisis had passed, Ronan and Naerya retreated to their quarters. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally. The world was quieter now. No alarms, no urgent summoning. He sank onto the edge of the bed, removing his boots, and she followed suit, sighing in relief as she finally shed the tension in her body. She joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it," she whispered. He smiled, caressing her hair. "We did. Together." She raised her face to his, eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and vulnerability. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a deep, lingering kiss that carried the weight of all they had overcome. Their hands sought each other instinctively, and they let the closeness soothe the day's burden. In time, they lay back against the pillows, wrapped in each other's arms. He watched her for a long while, memorizing every curve and line of her face, the shift of those subtle patterns in her skin. Her eyes shone with warmth, unlike the cold distance he had seen at the start. He thought back to that moment in the ruin when she had teased him about the cold, telling him, "Too cold, human, then we must share one bed." Now he realized how far they had come from that stark necessity to a genuine bond forged in adversity, sealed by mutual respect and love. Gently, he threaded his fingers through hers. "Naerya," he said, voice low, I'm not sure what tomorrow will bring, but I know I want you with me." She brushed a hand along his jaw, leaning in so close her breath mingled with his. "I will stay with you, Ronan. Whatever path we choose, I want it to be ours." Their lips met again, a promise shared in silence. They let the warmth of that embrace carry them into the night, comforted by the knowledge that they had found their own measure of peace in a universe that so often felt cold and unforgiving. Sometime later, they gazed out the window at the jagged mountains illuminated by faint celestial lights. The hush of the facility surrounded them, broken only by distant footsteps of patrolling guards. He recalled how, when they first crossed paths, he never would have imagined ending up here, by her side, safeguarding a powerful artifact together. She turned her head, and in the dim glow, he caught the faint curve of a smile on her lips. He tightened his arm around her, letting the warmth of her body settle him. There were no more words to say. They had reached a conclusion that felt as final as it was hopeful. The ruin, the cold nights, the hunts, and the heartbreaks that once filled their separate lives now seemed distant. What mattered was this moment, this shared bed in a place that was neither fully hers nor his, a place they had begun to shape into a home through sheer will and compassion. And so, lulled by the soft hush of the alien wind outside, the two drifted into a restful sleep, certain that in the morning they would face whatever challenges came next with united hearts. Their story was complete in its own right, an end to the conflict that had brought them together, and a resolution to the question of the artifact's fate. They were changed by their journey, and as they held each other through the night, the future felt more secure, more promising. The entire planet might still be cold, but they had found the warmth they needed in one another's embrace, leaving no doubt that their final choice would always be made together.